Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and just like I did with the Rich Piana cycle, a ton of people have asked me to cover the Bostin Loyd cycle, so I'm going to cover that for you guys. He just posted this on Instagram a couple of days ago. I needed a day or so to look at it to try to figure out what he's trying to do, and some of my conclusions of his exact strategy are going to be a little bit amusing. Now, to be fair, this is by no means even close to the worst cycle I've ever seen, so I don't want people to think I'm going to totally rip it apart. It will probably do what Boston's trying to make it do. Now, one of the things I want to point out up front, I'm going to analyze it as a whole, but the truth is the fact that he's running a pretty hefty dose of DNP means this is purely a cutting cycle. Any concerns about how he thinks he's going to look during this cycle is really a waste of money and a waste of effort, because with the DNP, he's probably just running all the gear to try to gain a little bit of muscle while stripping fat off extremely fast. This is very, very much a cutting cycle. Now, because of the sheer amount of drugs involved, he will probably gain some muscle anyways, but normally guys who do a DNP stack, their goal is to just try to survive the DNP stack and, of course, try to hold on to the muscle they have, so they run a bit of gear. So that being said, because he's running a pretty hefty dose of DNP, he probably could have got away with just nothing but a very high dose of testosterone and some estrogen control and maintained all of his muscle, gained a little muscle, and ripped his fat down, and then did his other stuff. So until he comes off the DNP, a lot of the hardening compounds that are in here are going to be pretty much useless. They're actually going to be counterproductive to his goals, because the extra water retention and things from the test would help more with that. But it's interesting that he's running dry compounds in an extremely wet stack anyways. So let's go ahead and jump into what he's actually doing with the gear itself, because when we look at his different compounds, I want you guys to look down the row. We have, as far as injectable anabolics, he has Test Sip, Test Prop, Primobolan, EQ, Tren A, Tren Hex. That looks to me to be 6 different injectables. And when you notice his doses, he's not picking his doses based upon anything important. If you notice the standardized doses that are out there, unless the trend is at 50, a lot of trend is at 100. But it looks to me like he's trying to get to where he's injecting exactly 2 3cc syringes every other day. He's not really caring about his milligrams. He's just buying what are standard black market doses that are made by underground labs. These are really common doses per milliliter. So what he's doing is that he's pulling up 1 milliliter of each one of these drugs, so that he has 2 3cc syringes, so that he can just pin those every other day. And he very well might be doing this as his form of synthol, because he's not on any synthol. Now, let's look at what he's actually using. The first thing he's got up here, he's got Test Sip, 300 milligrams every other day. So that averages to about 3.5 shots a week, because if you guys look at the EOD schedule, it's going to be three shots one week, 4 shots the next, and then, rotating through a schedule. These things are in your system several days, if not several weeks, depending upon the ester, no matter what. So obviously it just overlaps over time anyways. So that puts him at approximately 1,050 milligrams of Test Sip. Now, I can see what he's doing. A lot of guys like to take longer chain esters and inject them twice or even 3 times a week to give you more stable blood levels. As to whether this is particularly effective or not, or it benefits you, is subject to massive debate. Most medical doctors, most endocrinologists who work with these longer chain esters would think this is silly, that something like Test Sip, you're not going to get particularly more stable blood levels going beyond 1 day per week. You could do it twice, but 3 times might be a little excessive there. But again, I can understand if he's trying to keep blood levels extremely stable. If that's his goal, for whatever reason, he might do that, and that's not an unreasonable way to do that, because these do spike at 24 hours and then slowly taper down. But what makes it weird is that he goes and he's trying to keep really stable blood levels, but then he goes in and he throws in 100 milligrams of Test Prop. EOD. Test Prop spikes at like 2 hours. So basically what he's doing, normally guys who want to run Test Prop and stay really stable will inject it every single day. So he's going through all this trouble to keep the Test Sip being released at a very, very stable level, but then he's throwing in a drug that spikes higher at a lower injection frequency than most people will do if they're trying to maintain steady levels. So he's getting a spike anyways. So he's spiking his testosterone in spite of his efforts to do the exact opposite with the Test Sip. So it seems a little counterintuitive. I'm not sure what it is he's trying to do there, but to each their own. I would have recommended, given that what he's doing, he's already running the big long chain ester, he could have just added more test sip and saved himself some extra cc's of oil. He could have cut down the amount he's having to inject at that point, unless he's just trying to get the cc's up to replicate a synthol-like effect for site injections, in which case I guess I understand what he's doing. But as far as stabilizing blood levels, running the test prop 3 times a week is kind of reversing his efforts to keep the blood levels extremely stable by running the sip at 3 times a week, or every other day, 3 versus 4. What he does next, he throws in 100 milligrams of primobolan every other day, at basically giving him 350 milligrams of primo a week. Now, primobolan is really, it's weird in his stack because he's already got a ton of tests. In fact, he's got anadrol later. This is a very wet stack. Primobolan is a very dry drug. It is very, very expensive. It is probably milligram per milligram the most expensive steroid in the world, and I know for a fact that it is the most expensive steroid to buy raw materials for out there, out of the commonly used ones. So it's the most expensive to manufacture. He's using so little of it because it's expensive. And again, it comes in usually 100 milligram per milliliter, and that's not because that's the max they can make it at. It's because it's so expensive to make that all the manufacturers, so they can keep the bottles at a reasonable cost when they're selling them, they keep it at 100 milligrams, because otherwise people are not going to pay 3 times the price for a bottle at 250 or 300 milligrams for one bottle of a drug. They're just not going to pay that when they see the price tag. It's just the way that people think bodybuilders do. They could make it a lot stronger, but everyone does it at 100 for that reason. But him putting that in there at such a low dose really seems kind of silly. And the reason for that is because primobolan is usually used by guys who want to stay really lean and chiseled and have that drier look, because it is a DHT-derived anabolic. It has a very, very mild side effect profile, so guys can add it in without it adding side effects, but it adds 0 water retention. In fact, if you used it by itself, your estrogen levels would actually tank. If you didn't use testosterone or EQ or something else with it, your testosterone levels, not your testosterone, but your estrogen levels will tank to 0. Actually, your testosterone levels will too, so that wasn't an incorrect statement. So, and some people feel that it has mild anti-estrogenic properties, although I don't think that it necessarily does. I think Masteron does, which is a very, very structurally similar substance. Primobolan having that's a little bit unproven at this point. But him throwing it in just seems random because maybe he had some around. It has no synergy like you would be thinking of going on here. It's not going to add very much to the testosterone's anabolic nature, because it is slightly milder milligram per milligram than testosterone for actual muscle building, and he's already got 1.4 grams of testosterone in the mix. So again, throwing the primo in just seems like maybe he had a little bit around. He didn't want to high dose it too much, but he wanted to just use some because he had it maybe. Because again, a guy his size, if they wanted to have a really dry stack, they would probably run a lot of primobolan, maybe stacked with a lot of Masteron, or particularly with a lot of trenbolone. And his tren isn't particularly high for a guy his size either. So let's get to his next drug. He then throws in on top of it some Equipoise. Equipoise at 250, again, a very common underground lab milligram per milliliter, so he can throw in 1 cc of it every time he pins. Well, the thing is, we're going back again to the same point of running 1.4 grams of test with wet orals in the same stack and trying to throw some EQ in to stay drier, because EQ has a very mild estrogenic profile. It's if you guys don't know what that is, EQ or Equipoise is boldenone undecyclinate. It is a reduced testosterone that also has a reduced estrogenic effect, meaning it's generally as anabolic as testosterone, but it's half as androgenic because it's reduced. And then it converts to estrogen at only 50% of the rate of testosterone through aromatase action, but the estrogen that it converts to is not normal estrogen. It actually converts into a reduced estrogen. So it kind of uses up some of the aromatase enzyme to convert into a much milder form of estrogen, so it actually causes less gyno, less water retention, things like that. There are guys out there I know who've run as much as 1 to 2 grams of Equipoise by itself without needing any estrogen control. You wouldn't be able to do that with testosterone. So, but again, he's throwing it in there. Generally, guys will add EQ to a test stack to keep the side effects from going any higher because it's so much milder. And he's running it, 875 is a reasonable dose for Equipoise. But again, it seems like he's just throwing it in because he had it, because it's generally a hardening drug. So normally, his other things, Primobolan, EQ, Tren, that is actually a pretty fantastic stack for a guy who wants to look dry and hard. It's just enough EQ to give a synergy from its mild estrogenic nature to really boost the anabolic effect of the Tren and the Primobolan, because you need a little bit of estrogen. That's actually a fantastic combo for someone who doesn't want to run tests and wants to look dry and hard, but to run all this EQ or a stack like that to try to stay dry when you're already running a bunch of high bloating drugs and you're running DNP, you're not going to look good anyways on the DNP. So again, I'm not quite sure why he did it. I can understand why guys throw it into the stack, a high side effect stack, to keep them from getting any worse. So that's probably what his logic is at this point. But the thing we get to it there also, this is one of those, he's injecting it every other day. Guys started doing that back in the day with Equipoise, not because it has any benefit. Equipoise will stay extremely stable in your bloodstream at one shot a week. I mean, make that clear. It is one of the longest chain, slowest releasing esters out there. You can technically get away with running it every 2 weeks and keep a somewhat stable level. Lee Haney was reported by his coaches and people who knew him to like to run it one big shot of it every 10 days. So he would go 10 days between injections on this substance, and Lee Haney looked pretty fantastic by most accounts. So he's got it every other day, which again, I'm not understanding with such a really long chain ester, other than he's just like, he likes to keep the daily volumes consistent. So every 48 hours, he likes to be able to pen 6 cc's. And so he's just putting that in the mix for that. So I don't want guys to think that there's any benefit to doing Equipoise the way that he's doing it there. He's just trying to add in another thing that he can keep the cc's consistent so he doesn't lose track of it, because Bostin is, not known for his math and intellect. It just lets him keep things easier. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. Now, the next thing he does, it really puzzles me. I am more than a little bit confused as to what he's actually trying to pull here. He's running 2 different short-acting trenbolones. I don't really understand what the benefit would be there. I can understand him wanting to just get more Tren in his system and maybe running a really long chain like Tren and Enthate, but Tren acetate and Tren hex are only slightly different in terms of their half-life. They're really close together, Tren acetate being slightly faster. Now he's running the Tren acetate at 50 milligrams EOD, and then he's running the Tren hex at 75. Now Tren hex is usually made at 75 milligrams per milliliter, and it's not generally that popular of a substance. It's out there. The only reason it's still out there is because that's what the original Parabolin was, made in France. Is the only human grade Tren ever made. So some underground labs and some pharmaceutical companies out there, like in China and other places, still manufacture the raw materials for this because there is a demand for it because of the old legendary Parabolin. But Parabolin wasn't particularly special for the same role Tren acetate usually does, potentially a slightly better job because it has a slightly more milligrams of the drug in it and slightly less milligrams of ester weight at the same concentration. But the thing is, with Tren hex, they also, because it's rarer and it has a certain higher demand in certain places due to the old Parabolin, it's generally more expensive. Most of the companies out there that manufacture this, that people who make this stuff buy it from, like again Chinese companies, they charge more for it. So it ends up being slightly more expensive to the end user as well, for no benefit over acetate. So I would again think it's a little silly, other than trying to be nostalgic, to use Tren hex at all. But he's mixing together 2 separate short chain Tren esters when the acetate is generally going to be a much better bang for your buck. It's going to be slightly cheaper and slightly stronger. So why he's buying the 2 and mixing them together, I don't really understand at all. Maybe Bostin can comment on that one day himself publicly as to what benefit he thinks he's getting out of that, other than just to be complex and cool, so that when he puts up a stack on Instagram, people go, oh man, that looks complicated. It's more complicated than it needs to be. Some of that's just, it doesn't make any sense. Alright, and then he goes to his orals, and then he's running 50 milligrams of Anadrol every day. I don't know why he would try to do that with all these other dry drugs other than to stay fuller, but again, I would say that someone trying to run DNP the way he's doing it, it would really make more sense if he just ran mostly wet stuff anyways, just to hold on to muscle tissue and strength and everything with the DNP in his system. It would be more anabolic overall. So the Anadrol makes sense. It's just rather interesting that he's running fairly high tests with Anadrol And anadrol is very difficult to control the bloating on. Even aromatase inhibitors do not stop the bloating on anadrol. So it's just weird that he's running it with something like 4 other dry compounds in the stack. Again, other than contest prep, but guys who use it for contest prep, bodybuilders usually use it only on the final day, like they do their full cut, they cut water, and then when they do their carb loading to fill back out, they use anadrol only on the day of their show, as far as bodybuilders go who really understand this. And yes, I know a lot of coaches who teach this to competitive bodybuilders. That's kind of how they use anadrol. It's just the final day. It's not something they run all the way through a cutting cycle. So his mixture of wet and dry compounds together, just it seems a little unusual. It's particularly knowing that the dry compounds aren't going to give him quite as strong of a benefit for being more anabolic on the DNP. And he's not going to look good on the DNP. You look pretty bad while you're actually on it, no matter how good you are, because it makes you look really flat and problematic. So if you wanted to avoid that, he'd probably be better with just all wet stuff, because it'll help fill you out more. But again, you've got to remember, you're not going to look good while you're on DNP. Then let's get over to his peptide before we cover the substances to control side effects. He's running his growth hormone split up to twice a day. He's running 2 different types of growth hormone. Again, doesn't make a lot of sense unless he just had a hold of a bunch of extra kits. So again, this isn't something thought out. I think it's pretty much a case of him just having a bunch of growth hormone laying around and blending the 2 because he's got the generics. Now, his pharma is at a pretty respectable dose. So why he's splitting it twice a day, is, I don't know, subject to debate. The only thing I can think of is that he wants a stronger synergy with all the androgens twice a day, because he's taking his DNP twice a day, and he's hoping to stay more anabolic while the DNP is peaking at his system, because the growth hormone really it's about approximately an 8-hour bleed after each injection. So he's probably splitting it up that way, but he's running 2 units of generic, 2 units of pharma grade twice per day. So that's 4 units per day. That's a pretty respectable amount, but it's also much, much more expensive. And then he's running 5 units of generic. In my experience, from everyone that I've talked to, experts and people really in the know, bodybuilders I know, coaches I've known over the years, the generic growth hormone is really terrible. It's usually poorly degraded, poorly made. It is actually, in terms of effects, his 10 units a day of that is actually only going to give you about the same benefit of between 1 and 2 units of the pharma grade. And so it's approximately 1/8 to 1/10 of the effectiveness of it, but it costs dramatically more. So really what you end up with is less bang for your buck from this cheaper generic growth hormone. So we're not going to count it as 10 units a day. We should say he's using closer to 1 to 2 units of real effect from it, putting his total growth hormone at about 5 to 6 units a day. So pretty effective with the amount of gear he's running. Because let's keep in mind, he's on 3.4 grams of gear per week. When you combine all 7 steroids together, injectables and oral, that's 3.4 grams. That's a pretty heavy amount, with about 5 to 6 units of growth hormone every day. That is a massive synergistic stack. Most guys would blow up on that. They would get pretty freaking massive. But again, it can help combat the DNP. Then we go over to his fat burners. He's running clenbuterol at 20 micrograms twice a day. Again, I think it's because he just likes, since he's doing a bunch of other stuff twice a day, it helps him remember, and he keeps everything consistent. There's a lot of what he does here is very OCD. It's not actually benefiting him, because Clen, for example, he's running a very low dose of Clen. Actually, he runs some things at high doses and some things at really doses that are borderline ineffective. Normally you would taper up Clen. So this is probably what he's starting at, and then over several weeks he's going to increase the Clen dose. Because I can't see, again, a guy Bostin size only using 40 micrograms of Clen for any length of time. But he's running 20 milligrams twice a day. The problem with that, there's no benefit to keeping the levels in your system stable. Clen stays in your system for days. A single dose of Clen has something like an effective half-life of around 40 to 48 hours. Your levels are not going to go too unstable even if you take it every other day instead of even daily. It generally works better done daily, but to split it up twice a day is absolutely pointless. This is a substance that stays in your system for, up to 4 or 5 days. And it's got a half-life of 48 hours. You don't need to take it every 12 to keep the blood levels completely stable in your system. So again, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, as far as his other HGH fragment, I've never heard anyone really say that the ACH fragment is that good. I've heard a lot of guys say that it seems pretty useless. Again, based upon a lot of, it's a controversial peptide. I'm not going to go into that because I don't really have an opinion on it, other than it may not be all it's cracked up to be. The other thing he does with his fat burning is he's taking T3 and he's doing it pre-bed. First of all, any medical doctor who prescribes this stuff, an endocrinologist, will tell you that T3 is actually more effective first thing in the morning on an empty stomach. You absorb it better, so by eating it in the evening when you're not fasted, you actually absorb less of it. He's actually running the minimum therapeutic dose that a doctor would prescribe. So he's running it at a dose there. He's not going to absorb all of it. He's going to lose quite a bit of it. So he's not even getting the 12.5 micrograms. And at the same time, so he's basically running less than the body would probably produce, but it's still suppressive. So all he's doing is suppressing his own production of T3 just slightly with a total dose due to the poor absorption, consuming the minimal therapeutic dose on a full stomach. He is just suppressing a little bit of his natural T3 while getting nothing out of it. So this is completely pointless. It's poorly thought out, and that's not when you're supposed to take T3. So again, what he's doing there doesn't make any sense. So the final thing he's got in here that we need to look at, again, I don't want to cover the ECA and crack because I don't know anything about crack. I have no idea what that is, and I don't care. It sounds like some sort of over-the-counter supplement. He's also running an EC stack combined with Clen. Again, they work through the same mechanism in the body. Clen is probably cheaper. I don't know why he's just not running more Clen. He's a hardcore dude, so I don't know why he's running the milder drug there. But, you know, to each their own. And combining the two together, when they both work through the same pathway. But as far as his side effect drugs, he's got 1 milligram of Arimidex every day. The amount of wet gear he's on, that sounds perfectly reasonable. That sounds like a good starting point, a good baseline. That should be enough to keep his bloat down, keep his gyno away, but again, keeping the bloat too low may not be beneficial on all this DMP. But the kicker is the anadrol is not, its bloat is not going to be controlled by the Arimidex because it doesn't work through that pathway in the body. It seems to work through actually having some potential cross-binding to the estrogen receptor, some cross-binding to the progesterone receptor, and it seems to elevate prolactin a little bit. So the whole point there is he's still going to bloat from the anadrol no matter what. Now the interesting thing, let's get to his Caber, which is Cabergoline, which is a dopamine antagonist, and it reduces prolactin. The reason he's got that in there is because he's got 50 milligrams of anadrol, and then he's got approximately, let me look at his tren. He's got his tren at around 437 milligrams per week. Honestly, his total dose of drugs that are going to potentially elevate prolactin are not very high. I mean, a guy his size, that's not a lot. I certainly know guys who run more, who are smaller than him successfully without a whole lot of size from the prolactin. But I would think definitely if what he's running is enough to probably need some Caber. The thing is, with the amount of Caber he's running, that's overkill. Caber is sometimes overpriced when it's out there, and so you don't necessarily want to use more than you need to, because Cabergoline used in excess actually lowers IGF-1 production at the muscle cell. It can reduce your gains and your anabolic effects, so you don't want to go too crazy on the dose. Normally, for the amount of stuff that he's on, a 0.5 milligram pill should be fine once, maybe twice a week. I think 3 times a week is actually overkill for his stack and the amount of Caber he's running. You should be able to lower your prolactin into the normal range, actually below the normal range, even on the substances he's on, while on the Caber. So why would he use the Caber with this stack? Reduced chance of prolactin and estrogen synergy gyno, and to enhance sexual performance. Caber is pretty amazing for, again, helping with certain erectile dysfunctions, and it reduces your refractory period. So basically, he wants to be able to have a lot of sex while he's on this stack. To run Caber twice a week at least would be the intended goal, because once a week, because this drug stays in your system 7 days. So twice a week would be what someone on his stack would do to get their sexual performance higher than normal. He's on all this test, all this trend. If you get prolactin in check, it will help him have multiple sexual sessions per day. to run it at twice a week. And 3 times a week, I think, is just overkill. I think he's just wasting a pill pretty much every week. And I don't think he's going to benefit from that. So overall, guys, my overall assessment of his stack, some of it makes sense. Some of it doesn't. He's probably going to get the desired effects that he wants off of it. I don't see why he wouldn't. He's going to gain muscle. He's going to lose a ridiculous amount of fat. And it will probably work for him. And because he's using so many cc's of gear anyways, he can still basically get a synthol-like effect, because he's known for his synthol and side injections if he just pins it into the muscles that he wants, because you've got basically 2 full 3cc syringes every other day. So that's 7, technically, let's see, 2 times 3.5. That's basically 7 3cc injections every week on average. That lets him put a synthol-like effect wherever he wants it. A lot of it doesn't make sense. He mixes up in his mind too much of how he wants to keep blood levels stable versus spiking them because of the way he's doing the different esters mixed. Not a lot of sense to that, other than he just has a bunch of stuff laying around and he just wants to use it all up. So I think a lot of his drug selection has to do with, this is what I've got tons of on hand. I'm not going to plan it out. I'm just going to use shotgun kind of a little bit of everything I have to make it less confusing and just kind of go through my supply, because it's not going to matter as much on DNP, because I just need to gain muscle while on this DNP and getting really ripped. I think that's his overall strategy, and that's why he mixes so many things together, because he really doesn't need the complexity he's got here. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.